Wow, a great group today. And good morning, everyone, again, and welcome to First Service Residential's latest edition of our Ask the Experts virtual series. Today, we'll be discussing how to successfully create, communicate, and enforce association policy in this new climate. We won't look back too much, but we will look at what the circumstances are today and what's stuck from the last 2 years, what we think will continue into the future. So we really want to be proactive and have that type of conversation today. Again, my name is Bill Worrell. It's great to see everyone again. I am a director at First Service Residential, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. Just a few housekeeping items. Number one, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and feel free to use the chat on your control panel. Thank you already. We have a good morning with an exclamation point that has come through. Nice to see you. We will also have a couple of poll questions today, which I'm excited about to get your feedback from all the attendees. So just a reminder that once the poll is taken, you'll select your answer that's relevant and for your community. And then we'll share the results from all of our participants today, which should be very, very interesting to learn. Once that's done and you've had a chance to review the results, please don't forget in the top right-hand corner, there's a little X. You can close out that window and go ahead and still have the webinar full on your screen. Again, feel free to take notes today if you happen to have a pen and paper with you. If not, that's okay as well. We will, as usual, record today's session, and we'll be sharing that recording with all of our attendees. In addition, we'll be posting this session as well to our website. So please feel free to share the link. You can always refer back to that as well. So thank you so much. Those are the housekeeping items today. And now we'll jump right into our panelists in alphabetical order. First, I'd love to welcome and introduce David Haber. David is the managing and founding shareholder of his namesake Haber Law. David, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill. Always great to be with you.
It's a pleasure. And next in our Orlando office, we have Lisa Higuera. Lisa is a regional director with First Service Residential. Lisa, thanks so much for your time.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And finally, Kim Pinillos in our South Florida High Rise Division, Vice President at First Service Residential. Kim, good morning.
Good morning, Bill. Thank you for having us this morning. We're really excited about this.
It's going to be a great conversation, especially as we wrap up the calendar year here. So thank you all again. So certainly creating new rules and policies and enforcing those policies can be difficult in a normal situation. We've seen a lot of changes since the beginning of the pandemic and how we do that, and how we communicate. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about those critical items today, really in an effort, again, to be proactive and give everyone a great roadmap to success. So today and moving forward, and success looks like better enforcement, better communication, and sharing of responsibilities. We asked all of the board members to submit some questions for discussion. We received a plethora of wonderful questions for discussion today. And we will dig into those questions as we go through today's webinar. So let's start by kicking off some clarity around this. It's about roles and responsibilities. What role does each person, each stakeholder play in this process? So we have the board of directors. It should not all be on them. We have your fining or enforcement committee. It should not be all on those volunteers either. We're just grateful to have them. We have your management team and your violation coordinators with your management team, and they have a critical role to play as well. So Kim, there are a lot of moving parts here, a lot of people involved. Perhaps you can kick us off here by talking a little bit about just the basics here. Who does what? What are the standard operating procedures with regard to setting up this process, and which type of role does each key stakeholder play in the process?
Thank you, Bill. So when we talk about roles and responsibilities with regard to association policies, we really want to look at defining those roles. So the board sets the policy and your property management team works with your grievance committee to enforce those policies. And let me also say that we really, from a best practice, look at a team approach for this. So you really want to, when you're looking at your policies and enforcement, you really also want to involve your attorney, your management team, the board, and particularly it's very important to include some of your community as your grievance committee, or perhaps other individuals who may want to be involved with regard to the policies. Lisa, what have you seen?
Yes, so as you mentioned, the board does establish the policies and the rules, and I did want to kind of differentiate between policy and a rule. So a policy can be a process regarding a day-to-day issue, money collection, communication guidelines, conflict escalation and resolution, whereas a rule can be found in your governing documents. It sets the expectation of behaviors of owners. It limits or restricts a guest or an owner's actions within a community. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on those. But then I also wanted to check with David and see, how does an association board work with their association attorney as far as amending rules and reviewing those changes and enforceability?
You know, once a board decides a policy that it wants, again, based on what Kim talked about with the team approach, you bring in the management company and the lawyer, because the management company has the experience and it has the understanding, the historical knowledge of your community. You may be a new board. The management company knows what's occurred in the past. And if you want to change a policy or you want to create a policy, you get the historical perspective from the management company, and you get what you can and can't do from the lawyer. You may want a policy that's wholly illegal, and your lawyer is the one who has to tell you, whoa, slow down. You can't really do that. On the other hand, lawyers and management companies can tell you what policies work at other properties where the association's attorney works or where the management company is managing, and how effectively that policy has worked elsewhere, or how to tweak that policy because it hasn't worked as well at another location. And so all of that expertise helps you to get where you want to be. And I'm sorry for the noise in the background, but they're ripping out a door on the other side of the house.
And that's what happens in today's world. Absolutely. We're all virtual. Amazing. From Broward County, I'm in our state-of-the-art Palm Beach Gardens office. Lisa's in Orlando. So pretty standard. So as we break this down, as I understand it, and what I think is a best practice, is that certainly the management company can make recommendations what has worked at other communities. And we can help put that together and provide those recommendations to the board. It's also going to be our job to utilize our technology and our systems and our software as we do property inspections, log violations, make notifications of those violations, and really communicate to homeowners or renters, as the case may be, with regard to compliance.
Bill, I want to just step in for a minute and say that, especially in times like COVID, where policies that had never been considered, never been thought of, never needed to be thought of, in terms of wiping down elevators, can you use common elements? Having a property management company like First Service Residential that is dealing with this all over the state, as well as all over the country, having the expertise, knowing what's legal and what's illegal from your attorney's perspective when someone gets COVID, or if the county shuts down a certain area, and says you can't go here and you can't go there. But not just COVID, things that are standard in all condominiums, like construction rules, rules for use of the gym, whether children are allowed in the gym, pet rules, pool rules. Everybody has a pool, everybody has a gym, everybody has parking rules, everybody has construction rules. Not recreating the wheel, but utilizing the experience and technical knowledge that First Service Residential and your attorneys have is critical for any board that comes in and hasn't been there before, for example.
No, absolutely agree. I think that, sharing those best practices, it's one thing to have a rule that's needed in a community or a new policy that's going to be needed. as management, we focus on training when we go to enforce those policies. So it is about knowing and having the best practices and the experience, because I think when you're dealing with people in their homes, right, Kim and Lisa, I'll get you to jump in on this. It's a personal place to be. It's your home, and we have to be able to be trained to communicate properly, the why behind and what we've seen, and that I think is going to go a long way to enforcement and really help the violations committee or the rules and regulations committee or the board of directors, because if we can resolve the issue up front efficiently and quickly, just through staff training, we won't even have to go further down the road. But I think also to David's point, Kim, and then we'll go on to the next question, just a couple of closing comments on this one from you and Lisa. Once we get all that work done and set up and decide with board direction, hey, this is what we want to accomplish, we do need to get it over to Association Council, their David Haber, if you will, just to make sure that it is enforceable, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to set something up that isn't enforceable. David will then make the recommendation, review the documents, ensure that it's enforceable, and the association has the legal support it needs to. Anything to add to that type of analysis in this?
Bill, I did want to add, and David had mentioned this point, that when the board is establishing the rules, I think it's important that when they make those regulations that they're solving a problem, right? You know, you brought up the idea of COVID. You want to make sure that it's improving the community and you're keeping in mind the resident safety and increasing property values. I think those are important when establishing rules. And then you also mentioned, Bill, the why, the reason behind why this rule is being implemented. I think if residents understand why, they are willing to buy in. And then also communication was another factor that you mentioned, making sure that you're getting it done through email, message boards, community newsletters, town hall sessions. There's so many platforms that make communication easy for association boards. And I think it's important when you're establishing new regulations.
Right, great, absolutely.
And Bill, as I'm sure Kim can tell you, things backfire when there's bad communication with the owners. And what the real key is to explain the policy reasons up front, rather than just going out to the unit owners and telling them this is the new rule we're proposing. And maybe Kim can talk about how critical it is to be ahead of the game when it comes to communication and how to avoid that pitfall of owners feeling surprised that someone's pulling something on them.
No, David, you're absolutely right. It's really important that you involve the community, whether it's town hall meetings, workshops, right? To have a community discussion about the rules or policies and why they feel the need to put these in place. Form a committee, right, of volunteers within the community. Get involvement, get their buy-in so they understand the impact and the why behind the rule. And then following that, it's all communication. I really feel like effective communication is the key to all of it. So I think, you know, with even follow-up reminders, right? But include your community, include everyone in the community that wants to participate in the process.
Kim, excellent point. I just want to highlight that. You know, we sometimes poll residents in advance to get everyone's feedback, and that data is critical. You know, 75% of all owners said we need this, right? So that's really wonderful. And I love that idea of communication, those town halls, to have the open conversations with the committee and with the community to say, this is what we're thinking and this is what we're working on. And that way it's not just, hey, I sent out a new rule and regulation tomorrow, we're going to start enforcing it and there's going to be this huge fine. It's more of a human approach. So excellent. I just want to highlight that. And it moves quickly into, or just perfectly into, our next question. Tough question. We got a lot of this same type of question from a board member. It says, one of the greatest challenges of the last year and a half has been creating rules that residents don't necessarily agree with. So this was a lot about health and safety and COVID, the pandemic, of course. What are some of the best practices to make it easier for boards to create rules without creating enemies? And by the way, we're the same. None of us want to make enemies in the communities that we work and live in. So Lisa, can you kick us off with that, please? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think communication again keeps coming up in our discussion. That is definitely one of the keys to making sure that the residents understand the reasoning behind the regulations. And then yes, involving them in the process so that way they feel that they have some type of input because this is the community in which they live. And I think it's great to have that participation and that feedback for the board, because the board might not understand a certain perspective because they're working behind the scenes. So I think feedback, participation, all of those are key to get that buy-in from the residents when you're establishing those regulations.
Great. Kim, your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with Lisa. I think inclusion is really important. We touched on that a little bit earlier. Include the community. Ultimately, everybody may not agree on a particular policy or rule, but if they've been included in the process, they're less likely to be obstructive.
Right, exactly. And before I want to pull David in on this as well. We talked about communication. I mentioned the word proactivity. So not to be just talking points, but just to give that maybe a high level outline of that. That is a communication plan, right? So that could look like, poll the residents. This is what we're thinking. What do you feel? Yes or no? And then a text box so people can check that in. Get all that data in. Second, town hall meeting. That's a communication piece to everyone. Let's talk about this in an open forum, not an official board meeting. No decisions are going to be made, but we want to continue to receive feedback. Third, next steps, drafting, sending it over to the attorney. What do you guys think? Can we enforce this? What does your management company think? What are the best policies? And then, working that through the process. I think that helps too with the membership to see that there's a thoughtful approach that, it's not one size fits all in our business, right? Every community's got a lifestyle, and that's what we want to support. So, David, your thoughts on those best practices as well? Anything to add where you've seen success, where we're not out there to try to make enemies, we're trying to help improve communities?
Well, I agree with what you just said about starting with a poll, which gives you cover, because if you have a majority of the people in the community wanting it, that's great cover for the board, because you're doing the will of the majority in a democracy for which you're elected. Town hall meeting second is a great idea. Then communicating the results of the poll and the town hall meeting, so everybody, even those who couldn't be there, can understand what was occurring before you have the board meeting. The only thing I would do differently is I'd bring the lawyer in up front because I wouldn't go down a road without knowing whether it's legal or illegal to even go there. So I wouldn't necessarily waste the time going there. The other thing is, let management and the lawyer take some of the deflection of any frustration from individual owners. You are never, as Kim said, you're never going to please everybody. It's a community, and communities have divergent opinions. The goal is to try to hear everybody, and as Kim said, to try to bring everybody into the process. And as Lisa had said earlier, if you have that good communication and everybody is part of the process, then it's a lot harder for people to feel left out. They may not agree with the result, but they have not been left out of the process.
Right. Yep. Great points. Absolutely. Good tips for everyone today. The next question is also from a board member, and then we're going to go into our first poll today. Are there certain events that should trigger a review of association policies and rules? Are there certain policies that should be reviewed regularly? So Kim, again, I'll start with you on this. What does that cadence look like? Is this an annual thing? Is this a, every 3-year kind of a process? How do you feel about reviewing association policies and rules? And then we'll go to David and Lisa as well.
So Bill, thank you for that question. I think it's an excellent policy for the association to review their policies and rules on an annual basis. What we've seen in the last year or two with this pandemic is great demographic changes across a lot of communities. And that's another thing that may trigger a board to want to make some changes in policies or rules. You may have had a community which was primarily seniors, which is now shifted to more families, or vice versa. So demographic changes can also cause a shift, a necessity for a shift in policy. And then the other thing that will cause a shift in policy or rules is legislative changes. And I think David can talk to us about some of the legislative changes that have required rule changes.
Absolutely.
policy
Lisa,
changes.
your thoughts, and then we'll go to David.
Yes, I definitely think it's important to revisit old rules and regulations just to make sure that they still serve their intended purpose and that they still apply today. I can give you an example. I had a community that had discriminatory language in their documents regarding children, and they had to make a change once they issued a violation letter. And it went up to the Human Commission on Human Relations. So when you get a situation like that, I think it's time for an association board to definitely review the documents, make sure it's still enforceable and that it applies today.
David?
Well, it's not just what's already been talked about, but conditions in the community, world events, economic events can also cause you to review your policies. And I'll give you 3 examples. The use of emotional support animals and what that caused over the last 10 years in terms of changing regulations and FHA regulations federally and statewide affected how you look at pets and filling out of the forms and creating the forms for people to fill out on what's a real emotional support animal. Another one would be obviously COVID, which is a world condition that obviously caused changes to rules and regulations regarding conditions around condominiums and homeowners associations for the last 2 years. And then let's look at economic conditions. In 2009, you were not as rigorous necessarily in enforcing a late payment. If someone was out of their work job and they said, I need an extra 20 days to pay, you would rather wait that 20 days than send them to lien collection when the association, when basically the unit's underwater and you may never get paid. Whereas in an environment like today, where people are paying 1.5 times the fair market value in cash in 30 days, sight unseen, you're a lot less understanding about delinquencies. So market conditions can change things, world conditions can change things, social conditions can change things, as well as your annual or biannual reviews.
Right. Excellent point. There's exogenous variables. I mean, they do impact our decisions, and the economy is that, the pandemic is that, and so great point on that. So a concrete takeaway, I think, from that question and discussion for that board member, every association should have, their board anyhow, should have their annual business calendar, right? And that is start your budget review, annual election, those types of annual fire alarm inspections, whatever that is. And so what does that look like? So have your annual review with your violations or grievance committee on that calendar as well. Set that up so that there's a scheduled time and a meeting just to sit down and go through, make sure that we're on top of everything. By the way, I think you might also take a few old legacy rules or policies that just don't make sense anymore. Back to Lisa's point, right? If the demographics have changed in a community, just don't need it anymore, go ahead and clean those out and then and get rid of those at the same time.
Bill, there's one point, and I'm sorry, but I forgot to bring up, and that's technological changes. With technological advances that have occurred, you have to review your rules. 10 or 15 years ago, we didn't worry about plug-in electric vehicles. We didn't worry about Zoom board. We didn't worry about many of the things, using email voting. These were not on the table. And if you don't review your rules and keep them up to date, you're not going to be able to function and communicate with your membership properly.
Right. And again, I know it's a detail and it's an excellent point, David, but you also don't want your rules package to hopefully it doesn't get this thick. And I've seen that happen over time. And this one's been recorded at the county, and this one's been recorded. Now you get lost in public documents. So really keeping that, because with the communication, who's going to read through all that, right? So really keeping that as succinct as possible and relevant to the community and to the time. So excellent point. Eleanor, you're administering this perfectly. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and go to our first poll here. So how often does your board review your association policies? Please, every one of our attendees, make a selection and we'll show the results here. This will be interesting.
We're not allowed to skewer the votes by voting, right?
No, we're not allowed. We're gonna keep this very transparent, of course. Okay, a couple of minutes. Give everyone a chance. Okay, Eleanor, I'll look for the results when they're on the screen. Okay, there you go. 35%. The number one is rarely, only when changes in laws and regulations. And then look at what's tied. Never or every year. Very interesting. So I think something, so Lisa and Kim taking this to our board meetings, just having that conversation, we want to check in, right? Every community is going to be different. Some are not going to require as much. Some are going to require more. But good thoughts. Let me go around the horn on this. Go ahead and close your poll. Kim, I'll let you go ahead and start off. What are your thoughts on that? Not a whole lot of annual reviews going on.
I'm a bit surprised at that, especially coming through this pandemic. I do want to share a little story with you. I have an association who's right now in the process of doing this, and it is a 50-year-old association. And just as you talked about, Bill, they had, you know, rules here, rules there, some recorded, some not recorded, right? And it would be very difficult for a unit owner to navigate all of that. Mm-hmm. So we want to achieve compliance. You want clean documents. So they went to their attorney and said, this is what we want to do, put all this in one new, concise, clean document. And that's what they've done. So we'll have ultimately a new set of documents with new set of rules and one concise package now, instead of it being in 5, 6, 7, 8 different packages, as we've seen over the years as communities change. And that was I think a wonderful example of a proactive step. And now they're going to send that out to the community prior to voting on it, and they'll have a whole new clean set of documents and rules.
Mm-hmm. And a great point. So they're getting cleaned up, very proactive. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some legacy stuff. They haven't looked at it for a while, but they're not, now they're catching up. So I think a key recommendation there is it's never too late. Just because it hasn't been done, let's do it now. Lisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's great for the well-established communities to work on consolidating that information so it's available to the residents. But yeah, on the poll, I think, yes, it's important for associations to definitely review their policies and their rules at least annually, just to make sure that those rules are still relevant, that they're not outdated.
Yeah. And David, any final closing thoughts on this one?
I was just shocked that over 50% either rarely or never review the rules. I have to be honest with you. Best practices are to review them every year, every 2 years at the latest, especially given current events, you know, and every time we take over an association, the first thing we do is talk to the board about reviewing the rules. And when we take over a new association after turnover, it's one of the first things is to review the declaration and review the rules in order to change them from pro-developer, if you will, to appropriate rules for people who actually live in a community, which are, you know, two different things and oftentimes in conflict.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought that up, David. Every community is different in their life cycle. I know, as I see at least one of our attendees today is on the board of an association that recently turned over from a developer. And so, as you know, those rules are, you know, written and approved by the developer. They're very limited. They don't reflect at all. So now when you're a turnover board, now it's time to look at that and draft something that matters to the actual population, to the folks that actually bought into the community, right? So that's a new challenge for a new board.
Yeah, and remember that developers want things as flexible as possible, okay? They don't want limitations and restrictions on anything that might affect their sales. But people actually living in a community want to be able to get along and cooperate and have certain not overly restrictive, but certain restrictions that make it easier for people to live and coexist. So it's a totally different perspective, and their policies and reasoning are much different.
Excellent. And I know we're going to get into the fining committees here in just a short minute. Our next question, a really good one over the past year and a half, 2 years, from a board member. What are you seeing in communities you work with? Have they changed the way and the approach a policy or a rule to policy and rule creation and enforcement? Lisa, I'll let you start us off there. This is about the approach, right, to this whole process. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen?
Right. So during the height of the pandemic, some communities revised some of their violation verbiage, acknowledging the challenging times that the residents were experiencing, but they were also explaining their responsibility and their obligations to notify the membership of a violation. There was also a little bit more leeway, a willingness to provide extensions of time for members to resolve their violations until stay-at-home orders were lifted or until the association felt it was reasonable enough for the owner to comply. I think there was also a shift in operations for the association, more of an online platform basis. I think David mentioned, the virtual meetings. I think there was a shift there for associations in establishing some of these rules and enforcing the rules. I think making it available for owners to have maybe committee meetings or attend board meetings virtually, so that way that they could communicate and understand why the process of violation enforcement was being done. So I think there was some changes there.
Okay, and Kim, your thoughts?
I'm going to say that I think we've seen a bit more compassion and more of a common sense approach. A good example of that is I have a community that has a large population of Canadian owners. Well, they were prohibited from coming to the country, so they couldn't resolve an issue on their balcony, right? They couldn't remove their balcony furniture last year in hurricane season. So, really having, as Lisa said, the operational team help, right? You reach out to the owner understands, the owner wants to comply, but they physically can't. So having our operational team working with the board, having our operational team assist in moving that furniture, right, inside the unit, the residents now complied, they're happy. And we got what we really needed overall in the community, which was compliance. So I would say overall, a little more compassion and common sense we've seen.
And David, before I flip it over to you for your thoughts, to add to Kim's example, there's another example in buildings, high-rise buildings, and we're seeing the conversations now in HOAs. And what happened during the pandemic was we had a lot of policies where we wouldn't allow deliveries into the building. We had staff that would sanitize deliveries. This could be carry out food, this could be groceries, this could be a FedEx package. We would sanitize the masks, the gloves, we would take them up and personally deliver them to units. And what we found through that process, it was the necessity in the beginning to keep everyone safe and healthy, right? And to limit the traffic in the building. But what we found through that practice was residents' feedback and board feedback that they really liked also the less traffic in the building of folks they don't necessarily know. So a delivery person comes into a building, you let them up the elevator, and where do they go? Right now they're kind of roaming the halls in the building. Or in an HOA, they get through the guard gate and they're driving around the community and what's going on. So from an access control and a security perspective, that's another great example of where that staff delivering for the community and directly to doorsteps and a higher level of resident services, that's sticking around in a lot of communities. I wanted to add that story to the conversation as well, and then let you tell us your thoughts from a legal perspective.
I think that like I said earlier, technology and world events are such that things have changed so much in the last 2 to 3 years, including electronic voting, Zoom meetings, Uber Eats, and food delivery services, grocery deliveries, people not wanting to go to Publix anymore and having their food delivered on a weekly basis. That requires, as you said, Bill, additional services. Those don't come without cost. but it's also a discussion of redeployment of resources of an association. If people aren't driving as much, and many people in high rises are coming down here from up north without cars, then maybe you need fewer valet people, but maybe you need more people, bringing packages up and down. There's all kinds of things that are changing because of the changing dynamic in the community and in the world, as well as the economy. And I also think that, as was stated by Lisa and Kim, people need to work together more. People have seen, everybody's heard of people who they know or people they know's family who have died from COVID. There is more compassion and understanding, and there needs to be more understanding because we live in a community. And that sense of community and being respectful of your neighbors, if you have COVID, staying in the house and not going to the gym or whatever the situation is, has really impacted communal living.
Right, exactly. And as you're answering, another recommendation that might be a great note for the board members on the call today is that, some of these services that we're talking about, we're just wrapping up the annual budget season now for most communities. And we've had those conversations, what are there additional costs? What are those costs? And we have to obviously responsibly get those into the budget and be sensitive to that. So maybe if you walk all the way back, maybe that annual review process that we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, perhaps that happens in June, and give yourself 30, 60 days, July and August, to get through that, finalize what the vision is, communicate with the community, know what you want to do. But then if there are any impacts to the next fiscal year budget, you also have time to work with that and prepare for that. And it's not an 11th hour, how are we going to figure this out now that we've already communicated and agreed that we want to do it? How are we going to figure out how to pay for it, right? So we really want to set the board and the committees up for success and give them a nice, comfortable timeline to help.
Bill, you also, I know it hasn't been mentioned yet, and I don't know when we're going to, but we have to remember that the tragedy of Surfside changes how communities look at themselves financially and from a safety perspective. And of course, government regulation is going to be much stronger. And of course, we know Tallahassee is going to pass regulations regarding life safety issues and reserves. And of course, you can't wait till November to make the decision that you want to increase reserves, because if you don't have a reserve study and you don't have an engineer look at your building in June or July, there's no way in November you can pick a number out of the air. You have to really think in advance now. There's a lot more in that area that has not been the subject or focus in years past.
No, agreed. We will have additional sessions on those topics. Great point. And I will tell you that, and we're planning a lot of work in 2022 around all of that, because we do want to be ahead of it. There are certainly changes coming, and we're monitoring that. So good insight there. Moving to the next question. Policy enforcement here is a big issue in our large HOA community, even with clear policies that are communicated often. So we're doing a great job communicating clear policies. Residents don't comply. How can we improve policy compliance? I think I want to work backwards on this. Let me start with legal. So David, what have you seen really work in compliance? And then I'm going to go backwards to Lisa and Kim, but we'll start with a legal perspective first.
Well, unfortunately, the Florida legislature limits fines to $1,000. And I can tell you that I represent some very high-end luxury condominiums in South Florida, where the average unit is $5 to $10 million, and slapping someone on the wrist with $1,000 of fines is not going to affect them when they're buying $10,000 bottles of champagne with gold flecks in it. They just don't care, or their children don't care, let's just say. And that's problematic. It's very problematic. In HOAs, you have rules about height of basketball nets. You can't have it in the front. You can't park in the swale, or whatever the issue is. And my sisters live in HOAs in Boca, and I can tell you that getting people to, follow those requirements is not easy. And of course, I think there is sometimes neighborhood pressure obviously letter writing and fining. The other part is getting people willing to sit on a grievance committee against their neighbors. That's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of politics involved. People don't want to make enemies of their neighbors. And I think Lisa and Kim can talk a lot more about that than I can.
I do want to bring Lisa and Kim in now and touch on this other question at the same time that came in. David, if you could just start us off as well with what is the process to issue a violation with fine to a repeat offender, all the way through collecting the file. And one thing I want to add to that question, David, give us also the worst case scenario. We all have seen that person that just continues to do the same thing. Thank goodness they're an anomaly. And they will not comply and they don't care. You're right. They're writing the checks for $1,000 there, whatever it is. So take us from the legal worst case scenario, because the board always has a resolution at the end of the day, all the way through. And then Kim, I promise, and Lisa, we're going to bring you guys in on the management side of things.
So the first thing is you have to have a grievance committee. The board cannot issue fines and the board cannot be on the grievance committee. So the first thing is you have a grievance committee. You give notice of a hearing. You have the offender with the opportunity to present whatever case they want to the grievance committee. Grievance committee makes a decision. Let's say they agree to fine him $100 and they're a repeat offender. You fine them, let's just say the worst case scenario, 9 more times and it's $1,000 and they don't pay. You lien their unit. You can then foreclose upon the lien. But you also have the right under the declaration and under the Florida statutes to file for injunctive relief. You have the right to go to court and sue that owner and say, this owner is not complying. And we, judge, want you to force this owner to comply. It doesn't matter what the regulation is, whether it's Airbnb or whether it's throwing disco parties with 100 people on Friday nights, or, you know, whatever the issue is. And there are many varied issues that we all know about, some more savory than others or unsavory. But the reality is it's still problematic, even though you can go to court, because I just finished litigating a case where an association spent over $250,000 against a very wealthy owner who was, I will just say, intransigent, and decided to countersue the association for selective enforcement. Now, there was no selective enforcement. And of course, the insurance carrier got in on the defense of the selective enforcement and breach of fiduciary duty claims, but the association still had to pursue affirmatively its claim, and insurance carriers don't do that. So now you've got 2 sets of lawyers, one being paid by the carrier, which is going to increase your rates, and one being paid from the association owners directly. So while it can be a win-lose in that if you ultimately win the case, you get your fees back from the owner, presuming that they have the money to pay, it really is more of a lose-lose for everybody. And the best way to try to resolve it is to have your management company sit down with the owner, maybe with a mediator and 2 sets of lawyers, and try to work through the issues to avoid the legal confrontation. However, as we all know, the richer the community, the bigger the egos sometimes, and the more money they're willing to throw at problems that should be resolved without resorting to legal means. But I would love to hear more from Kim and Lisa, who are in the trench dealing with it more day to day.
Yeah.
Oh, David, you mentioned a good point about selective enforcement. So I think to improve policy compliance, you need to be consistent, right? So if the board lays out the plan of how they plan on enforcing their regulations, I think the residents will feel that there is no selective enforcement, that there actually is teeth behind the compliance notifications that are being issued. Because if they don't understand what the consequences are, I think people get a letter and they disregard it. So I think it's very important to continue that communication. I know a lot of communities do a good job about communicating about expected, behavior and their rules. But as long as we're consistent with that enforcement, I think that's where you get the majority of your compliance.
I wanted to throw one thing in, Lisa, in response to that, and that is that same association had a rule against short-term rental, but didn't know it. It was in their declaration, and the board and the manager did not know it because it was in, one of the old amendments that, of course, if you don't have a good set of documents, people don't even know what's in there. And the owner that claimed selective enforcement said, you're not enforcing your Airbnb rules. Well, a new board came in, looked at the amendment and said, he's right. So when that happens, you have to give clear communication to your owners. This was not previously being enforced by a prior board. However, the new board is going to enforce it. We're going to give you X period of days to get into compliance, or X period of months. And as of Y date, going forward, this will be strictly enforced. So there has to be communication when a rule that's already in existence hasn't been enforced, and nobody may even have known about it. So there are contingencies that you have to take into account, and you have to talk to the management company and the lawyer, and then you have to have very good communication with the association members.
Absolutely. Kim?
I'm just going to add, I think one of the best tools that we've seen is really the human factor, right? When we really are trying to get compliance, a lot of times we have unit owners that are not in compliance. They may not even be in the country their unit's rented, right? Which is one issue. So having the manager talk to that renter, talk to that owner that is in the unit, and explaining the process to them sometimes cures a lot of it without having to go further. So I always feel like starting with the human side and the human factor goes a long way.
I agree with that. And I think that, I want a couple of other recommendations here that I've seen. I'm working with another developer community now. I say developer, they've just recently turned over. And also more mature communities. And just to make a recommendation that David touched on, sometimes people look at me when I make this recommendation, but I like to go to the attorney first, with board permission, of course, and just request, listen, give me everything that's recorded, and in sequential order. Even developer communities, even new communities, it's not uncommon at all for developers to file amendments and different things that are out there. But to your point, part of this is preparation, and it's knowing everything that's out there and protecting yourselves up front. I think that the second item I would add, or recommendation in this conversation, is that if you find yourself in that situation with a repeat offender, you can also help to mitigate that up front. And when we've talked about the communication plan and policy, that is communicating all this. But at the end, when you're approving, what is the enforcement process you're communicating as well? It's a whatever it is, but we have a standard process: a phone conversation, in-person conversation. Kim, to your point, build the relationship. Most of the time we'll get compliance there. Then you're going to send a violation notice. Then it's going to go to committee. Then it's going to be a fine, all the way up into, but everyone needs to know there could be this mediation and ultimately go to court. I think it's good for folks to know that, because a lot of folks I don't think do know that the association can go all the way to where it needs to go to end up getting compliance on a matter.
Bill, I did want to bring up one point, because I think Lisa brought up the issue of tenants. Remember that you have a different tension when you're dealing with a tenant. A tenant who's paying a lot of rent to an owner, sometimes the owner turns a deaf ear to the association's complaints about the tenant being a violator, because in let's say a tough economy, they don't want to lose the renter. So one of the things we've done is create, in essence, what's called a lease addendum, that we try to have the tenant and owner sign at the time of lease execution, which allows for the association to directly enforce the rules against the tenant, including eviction. Because to sue an owner, to force the owner to sue the tenant to evict, is a very long process. Having the assigned right to evict a tenant for rules violations is a much more direct route that we have found usable in order to stop the tenant from violating. Because quite frankly, someone paying $5,000 a month could care less whether you fine them $100, and the owner could care less because they're collecting $60,000 a year in rent, and they don't want to lose their renter and have to go unrented for 4 months.
And David, one more question. I need to go to our next poll, but just quickly, as we're discussing this, sometimes the fines aren't enough, and I've seen boards ask me, it stumps me all the time, what about the peer pressure approach? So can we talk about this at an open board meeting that we have pending legal action? It's going to cost us extra money because we have to go over here and deal with this. Can you help me answer that question? Is that an appropriate topic in an open board meeting? Because it's true, if it does go there, the person is actually suing himself through the association. And I do see you on mute, but your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, let me tell you, there's a real tension when it comes to neighbors going after neighbors. And we've heard of the worst case scenarios,
Right,
of people assaulting one another over not paying assessments or violating the rules or banging on each other's doors or writing salacious emails or letters and sticking them under everybody's door. And then there's defamation lawsuits between owners. I liked the approach you mentioned earlier with Kim about trying to sit down compassionately with owners, because the minute you get owners in each other's faces, you run the risk of losing control of the association and having total bedlam. And then you get the board, being sued for allowing owners to go off and act in a renegade rogue fashion. So I don't have a problem with discussing rule violations at board meetings, but I do tend to not want to have people take the law into their own hands, if you will.
thank you for that recommendation. Kim?
Yeah, Bill, I think that when we're talking about that, we really need to focus again on that human factor, as David said, and
It's true.
work with all the parties to get the issues resolved. It's
Yeah.
really in everybody's best interest.
Yeah, that helps me. Thank you. I get that question quite often, and we don't, it's a last resort. We don't want to have those types of issues. Okay, so Eleanor, let's go to our next poll here. If we could put it up on the screen. Does your community, I love this. I've been waiting for this all morning. Does your community have a grievance and violation committee? We'll give everyone a couple of moments here to respond to this. I'm looking very interested in the data that comes back on this one. I know there's so many places where there's been a challenge getting the volunteers. It's kind of a thankless job.
Or in getting them to actually have meetings. You can have a committee and they don't ever meet.
That's right. That's a good point. Okay, we'll see if the results here, Eleanor. No, and that
Wow.
doesn't shock me.
Wow.
I'm very happy that there's 0 unsure. So that's great. So everybody knows you either do or you don't. 2/3 to 1/3. No versus yes. So let me see here. Lisa, let's start off with you on that. Not shocking data, right? We see this all the time. Give us your thoughts on how we can help to improve that.
Yeah, so again, it's not a shock. Communities struggle to find individuals to participate on community boards, let alone to volunteer on a violation committee. I think we mentioned this point before, where sometimes it could be intimidating for residents to, be on a violation committee. They might not feel comfortable judging their neighbors or penalizing their neighbors for a violation. In my experience, I have less than a handful of communities that I work with that actually have violation committees. So I think educating the residents about the importance of having such a committee so that the association has the ability to continue to enforce their policies and regulations, I think is important. I think an educational piece is needed so that way we can get that buy-in from the residents in the community.
Mm-hmm. And Kim?
I think one of the important things, and one of the things that we found very effective, because it is difficult, as Lisa said, and as we all know, to get people to serve on a grievance committee, is to have a grievance. When you compose your grievance committee, get some alternates on your grievance committee. That way, if you have somebody and there's a violation coming up, and for example, was my next door neighbor and I wasn't comfortable being the one sitting in the grievance committee meeting, making a judgment against my next door neighbor for or against, I might want to have an alternate sit in the place of me on that committee. So that's another way that we found that's been helpful in getting people engaged. They don't feel like they're have to do every one. And virtual meetings, right? You no longer have to go to the clubhouse or the meeting room and sit through meetings and perhaps be, you know, within a few feet of the person who's violated the rule. It can be done virtually now as well.
So, and another question just came in from a board member, and I'm going to bring this to David. So a couple of things here occur to me. Number one, a recommendation, great recommendation on the alternates, Kim. And Lisa, great recommendation on engaging. And I think another recommendation has to go back to the beginning of this conversation, which was that communication plan. Hey, listen, we're looking for volunteers to serve on the committee. We're looking for feedback. Who would be interested in really engaging the community? And David, so this question comes in and they say, you know, how do we manage? And now we see the data. So folks without a committee are not alone. That's one thing to know. How do we manage? And I want to go into procedural here as well. But the question is, how do we manage without the committee? What can we do? And procedurally, I think management can still do their inspections and their notifications, right? But how can a board or a community really effectuate, go through that violation process? Any recommendations or thoughts on that if they just can't get the community or the committee together?
Before I say that, I do want to say that Kim's concept of alternatives, I never thought of it, but what a brilliant approach. If you don't want to deal with your one particular neighbor, it doesn't mean you can't serve for the rest of the community. So I think that was really spot on. And I love the idea of Zoom, so you don't have to be face to face with an angry neighbor. That's another good one. I really like that one. In terms of what the alternatives are, you have letters from management that can be sent. You have letters from the law firm that can be sent, citing the rules, citing the violation of quiet enjoyment or whatever the issue is. You can threaten legal action, and you can go to the governmental authority. If someone is doing construction without a permit, you can go to code compliance. You can go to the building department. If someone is making noise at 2 o'clock in the morning every night, you can again go to code compliance. So you have the governmental option, you have the lawyer option, and you have the management company option, so that the board itself has alternatives beyond the grievance committee. Because remember, if it doesn't work at the grievance committee with the fine, those are the three alternatives you have to go to next anyway. So all you're really doing is bypassing the committee and the $1,000 worth of fines that may not work, and going straight to legal or straight to management or straight to the city or town.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, you know, so beautiful, perfect recommendations, and really a perspective on that process. And based on those last poll results, we definitely know that we want to go out there and we want to focus on the communication and engaging the community. And then we want to focus on the process and make sure that we can enforce with or without a committee, but hopefully we can convince more folks to get involved in their community.
And Bill, one other point that Lisa made, which is the communication about rules and regulations. When you have multiple people violating certain rules and regulations, it may be that people are just not aware of all the rules and regulations, which of course is why you put them up on the website. It's why you discuss them in board meetings and town hall meetings. It's why you get community buy-in up front, so that when you have a violator or repeat violator, they've already been exposed to the process. They can't sit there and say, I didn't know. That's the worst. If someone says, I didn't know, it means we have failed as managers, lawyers, and boards.
Yeah, I think that sticks the landing, David, and I appreciate that perspective. That's to respect everyone's time. It's noon. A lot of folks are going to run out and grab some lunch right now, Eastern time, and that's all the time we have for today. So Lisa, Kim, David, wonderful panel. Thank you all so much for your engagement, your time today, and sharing with us. I do admittedly have some questions that we weren't able to get to in the time that we have today. So I do want all the attendees to know that anything that we didn't reach out to, we'll assign it to the right person, whether it's David's office or our local management team. We'll make sure that we get those answers back to you and any community specific answers as well. So we'll make sure you get the support that you'd like. And again, to all the attendees, look for the recording. It will be coming out and it will be posted on our website. Thank you all for attending today and spending some time with us today. We wish you all a very happy upcoming holiday season. I can't believe it already. And again, thank you all so much. We'll talk to you soon. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.